Welcome along to the unit analysis series. This is a series where I focus my attentions on particular units. I haven't made a video for this series for quite some time, and in my previous videos I was looking at units from the biblical period, and I think this is my first video concentrating on a unit from the classical period, and I've decided to have a look at a rather unique unit, the Balearic Slingers. Balearic Slingers. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to talk about a little bit of their history, their use on the battlefield, and then in the second part of the video I will examine how they are used and represented in the game. Okay, so the Balearic Slingers. Slingers were popular in the Greek armies of the Hellenistic period because they were more cost effective than archers, as their stone-lead projectiles cost less than arrows. Certain regions were well known for their slingers, such as the famous slingers from Rhodes. Then we have the legendary slingers from the Balearic Islands. Balearic comes from the Greek word which means to launch, balo. Early records mention warriors from these islands using slings to great effect to defend their land. Throughout the 5th and 4th centuries BC, the Carthaginians continuously recruited Balearic slingers. They recognized the value of having very mobile and well-trained troops on the battlefield. And these units, actually, when I looked in the game, here's a quick quiz question for you. Which lists actually have access to these units? I'll give you a few seconds to think about it. And the answer is, unless I'm completely wrong, and you can correct me in the comments below, it is only the Carthaginian lists. And as far as I know, all of the Carthaginian army lists have access to the Balearic Slingers, and no other lists have access to them, which was a little surprising to me, because actually when you look at a unit like the Cretan archers, they pop up all over the place. They're in lots of army lists actually, but not so with these slingers. In the 2nd century BC, a Roman general tried to invade Minorca, but failed due to a huge barrage of stones that kept hitting his ships and damaging them. The Romans had to devise new ways to protect their ships in order to land, and they eventually made an agreement with the local tribes, who they later incorporated into their armies. In terms of effectiveness, apparently a slinger had a maximum range of 400 meters, about 1,300 feet, and was deadly from 120 meters, about 400 feet. 3 different slings of different lengths were used depending on the distance of the target to be shot. At the Battle of Trebia in 218 BC, skirmishers, including the Balearic Slingers, were the first Carthaginian warriors to confront the Romans in an attempt to disrupt the front lines before Hannibal led the army to a decisive victory. 2 years later, the Balearic Slingers were again used at Cana and beat back the Roman light infantry, which comprised of javelin men and Cretan archers. Due to the longer range of the Balearic sling, apparently the sling had an effective range of 492 feet compared to 442 feet of the Cretan archers. The archers' arrowheads were quite heavy, and this limited their range. So apparently, from a historical point of view, the slingers had a greater range than archers, which is very interesting to hear. Maybe there's some debate about that. We'll maybe talk about that a bit later as well. Historians ask the question as to why the sling fell out of fashion it is generally believed that slingers had a greater range than archers. However, in order to be an effective slinger, you need a lot of training and some power. Overall, it was probably easier to train archers in a shorter period of time. Another factor to consider is as armor became more popular in the classical period, because if you think in the earlier period, in the biblical period, it's lightly protected troops, but once we get to classical, I think these are all protected in this particular army. But yes, but obviously the Romans, and also there's some armies with armored hoplites. So armor basically becomes more prevalent, especially towards the later part of the classical period. And as armor becomes more popular, it's probably true to say that arrows had better armor piercing than lead shot, for example. Okay, so that's a brief snapshot of some of the history of these slingers, and now we will have a look at how we use them in the game. So now we are going to have a look at how the Balearic Slingers are in the game itself. Are they actually worth taking out? Well, let's have a look at the army composition first. This is the Carthaginian 262 BC list. And I would say the first thing to say about this kind of list, because a lot of the Carthaginian lists are fairly similar, you've got a tremendous variety of units. I've taken 2 elephants, but I could just take 1 depending on who I'm fighting. I love the noble cavalry. They're a bargain at 44 because they're superior quality. So that's fine with my cav. I've got a whole pile of heavy infantry. I've kind of maxed out at the top end. Got the max warband and the African spear and the mercenary hoplites. And then I've got my light foot. The Carthaginian lists, I always think that they're actually very good for beginners or players quite new to the game, because they teach you how to play with all the different arms of the army. You've got a load of light foot, you've got your heavy foot and a nice mix of medium foot as well. Then you've got your cavalry and some elephants, because not all lists have elephants. Not all lists have a load of medium foot. So this is quite a nice real mix here in this army, which is great. You've got also a lot of javelin horse to take out as well. So yeah, I do recommend playing with this kind of army. It can really help you learn all the kind of ins and outs of the game. So really, in amongst all of this, I think they kind of justify their price and inclusion, because you're not losing out. Okay, if I don't take out a Balearic Slinger 36, I can take Italian foot. That's not bad. If I want to go with more infantry, perhaps I could do that. Or, you know, I could use the points to upgrade my cavalry a little bit, but I'm quite happy with Noble Cav. And there's 16-point difference between the armoured Noble Cav and Noble Cav. That's a pretty big jump. So I'd only probably, in times of need, when I really feel I need more cav, I'd only probably take 1 or 2 more of these anyway. And these Spanish troops, they're wonderful because they're impact foot. And I've got 5 of them. So, you know, when I need my medium foot holding on rough ground or something like that, then I've already got 5 plus my spear. So yeah, I think I'm not really losing out. And as I'm going to talk about now, what do they give us? How do these units compare to your standard kind of light foot? Let's dig into the numbers. and see what I've found. So the first thing to say is that the main difference between these units, Balearic Slingers, is their quality. This is highlighted in how they act when taking charges from javelin men. Now, this is just one example, actually, but it highlights how they do differ. Unlike other light foot of average quality, Balearic Slingers will not evade, and this is something I tested out a lot, actually. Javelin men have the plus 100 on impact because of their light spear. Average quality light foot in my tests have, and actually they don't have slingers in this, but I'm talking really about slingers and archers, those units. They have a 75% chance of successfully evading from javelin men. But Balearic Slingers will not evade. This is one thing to bear in mind here. They will stand and fight. This is because they're only 50 down on the charge, because javelin men have got the light spear. They're plus 100 up against most light foot on the impact phase, but because of the quality, they're only 50 up against the Balearic Slingers, and so the slingers, these type of slingers, will hold and fight, and then in the next round, in the melee round, they will be 50 up actually on javelin men. So this can be a good thing or it can be a bad thing. Maybe a lot of the time, especially maybe at the beginning of a battle, you want to kind of just sort of be mobile, use your spears, use your bow and arrow, or your slings, and do some damage on the enemy and then run away and basically frustrate the enemy, as historically Lightfoot was the kind of thing they were doing, harassing the enemy. So if your Lightfoot right from the beginning gets stuck in a melee, then what often happens is the enemy main line comes up and then they get caught fighting against standard heavy foot, as an example, or even medium foot, and then they'll lose, and then you'll lose a unit that you've paid 36 for. So in some ways it might be a negative that they're standing and fighting. In other kind of situations, it might be a positive. If the enemy line isn't that close, then you're hoping in the next melee rounds that they're going to beat back these javelin men, and they've got a good chance because of their quality and being 50 up. So just something to bear in mind. And also in my tests on the charge, they had it was about 83% chance of holding against javelin men. Even though they're 50 down, they were holding. 11% chance of disrupting and about a 6% chance of fragmenting. That was what I was finding in my tests as a general kind of idea, just really. It might be different in your particular battles, but in general, that's what I was finding in my tests. Now, firepower. How much better are these units compared to, let's say, slingers, the standard slingers? In my tests, it comes to around 10% better. So they were getting around 10% more casualties than your standard slingers. This doesn't seem like so much, but in reality, it can make all the difference when looking at cohesion tests. And you've got to remember, I've said this a few times in my videos, often in this kind of game, it's not so much the casualties, it's the cohesion tests that are all important. That's how you win, really. When you disrupt a unit, fragment a unit, that's how it's set up for morale, rather than casualties as such. They are obviously linked, but really it is about those cohesion tests. And it seems that with how the game is set up, that extra 10% has a large effect on generating the cohesion tests. I first tested Lightfoot against citizen hoplites. These are protected troops. You will often find them in this period. There's quite a lot of armies with hoplites. And I was getting 100% of the time, I was getting cohesion tests on the second volley of fire with the Balearic Slingers. Now, how I was doing it, this is 1600 points because in the leagues and a lot of tournaments we play 1600 points in classical. So at 1600 points, this army, we get a maximum of 2. In my tests, I had 2 slingers and a standard slinger unit in one group. And in the other group, I had 3 of your standard slingers, and I was comparing the results because you're only ever going to have 2 max in almost all battles. So 100% of the time I was getting a cohesion test on my second volley. So I had the unit in front of me, or if we say here, it was my Balearic Slingers were firing away face on, and then I was trying to kind of simulate battlefield conditions. I was using the half arc for these units on the side, so I was getting my cohesion tests, which was excellent. Just the second round from the Balearic Slinger, the second unit, I was getting cohesion test. And with the standard slingers, it was only 20% of the time. Okay, by the third volley, because I had 3 units in front of one enemy heavy foot unit, I was getting cohesion tests 100% of the time on the third volley with your standard slingers, but it just meant that it was so much quicker when I was using the superior quality slingers. Armoured units were tough for all skirmishers. It was on the third volley that I was getting some cohesion tests on like armoured hoplites, for example. But with the ordinary slingers, I was not getting any cohesion tests at all. The casualty numbers were just so low, wasn't causing any cohesion tests. So again, even though the numbers for these units was low, 40% of the time cohesion tests, it was better than 0. So in that sense, it's really useful to have these units. I also tested against pikes. Pikes are also a little bit difficult because they are large units. They just take longer to whittle down. Ordinary skirmishers, ordinary slingers were having no luck. They weren't getting any cohesion tests, even by the third volley. And the Balearic Slingers had a 60% chance of a cohesion test on the third volley. So I had my 2 units firing away, and then I had 1 ordinary unit of slingers next to them, and that unit was getting a cohesion test on the third volley, and it was about 60% of the time. So that is pretty good. 60% of the time against 0 for the standard slingers. In conclusion, that extra 10% of casualties was often just enough to cause cohesion tests by the second or third volley of fire for the Balearic Slingers that I didn't get using standard slingers. In that sense, paying 36, and I'm a player who really, I don't use Lightfoot as much as other players. I prefer getting stuck in. I like my infantry and then supporting with cav, being fairly aggressive. So I often kind of balk at paying 36 for such a unit, especially Lightfoot. But when I looked at the results of my tests, actually, they're pretty worthwhile. And this is especially so against certain armies. Hoplite armies, it's probably worth taking them. Even other Carthaginian armies in some kind of civil war scenario, then it might not be. So actually Romans and maybe other Carthaginian armies, then it might not be worth taking them, because both of those kinds of armies, they've got a lot of armoured troops, and they've also got a lot of skirmishers that are just going to counter you. But against hoplites and actually pike armies, it might well be worth taking these kind of units out to help out with your standard skirmisher units. So overall, yes, they cost a lot. Your standard slingers 27, so they're 9 more. Archers are 30, but when you do all the number crunching, they do actually get quite a lot more casualties, averaging 10% more than your standard slingers, and more importantly, they will generally cause quite a lot more cohesion tests, which is what you want. So yeah, with this kind of army, when you've got all these different kinds of units supporting them, you've got all your heavy foot, you've got warband, impact foot, you've got medium foot with impact, you've got elephants, you've got cav, you've got it all. So actually they do have quite an important role to play. Okay, that's about it. If you've got any comments to make, please leave them below. If you like the video, give it a like. If you want to subscribe, you're more than welcome. I've done tons and tons of videos last year and the year before on a lot of army lists and top 10 lists as well, my favourite units. And I also did some top 10 of my what I classed as the worst units of all the different periods. Actually, I covered medieval, as well as classical and LA and biblical and so on. So you're welcome to check out those videos, and thanks a lot for watching. See you again soon.